It didn't shatter like glass. The first time anyone noticed it, trust broke like ice. Slowly, quietly, with a sound you felt more than heard. A woman stood in a cafe listening to her friend explain why she hadn't shown up last night. The words were gentle, reasonable. But in the space between them, something thin and translucent appeared, stretched tight between their chests like a pane of frozen air. Then a hairline crack formed. The woman blinked. So did her friend. The crack spread silently, branching, delicate and terrifyingly precise. When the lie finished landing, the invisible sheet fractured completely. It didn't explode. It peeled apart and dissolved into pale dust that sank to the floor and vanished. Neither of them spoke for a long moment. Across the world, the same thing began to happen. Trust, it turned out, had always existed as a structure. Fragile, invisible, constantly under tension. Now it had become visible. Whenever someone betrayed an expectation, even a small one, the bond between them manifested in the air and broke. Sometimes cleanly, sometimes violently. Sometimes so slowly that everyone involved wished it would just end. At first, people thought it only happened with lies. They were wrong. Trust cracked when promises were forgotten, when words were technically true but emotionally false, when someone chose convenience over care. A manager delayed a promotion he had implied was certain, and a thick, frosted band between him and his employee splintered down the middle. Parents watched thin filaments snap when they dismissed fears they didn't understand. Lovers saw their shared space fill with fractures long before either admitted something was wrong. The terrifying part was the scale. Some breaks were tiny, barely visible, microfractures that healed on their own if addressed quickly. Others were catastrophic, the air between people collapsing into jagged emptiness that refused to mend. And everyone could see it. You couldn't pretend nothing had happened when the space between you was still shedding ghostly shards. Public life changed overnight. Press conferences became theaters of tension. Each statement sent fine stress lines crawling through the air above podiums. One poorly chosen phrase could trigger a visible collapse, trust between speaker and crowd splintering in real time. Politicians learned to pause, watching the space before them as carefully as their own words. Some still lied. The room always broke. Courts transformed. Juries no longer debated credibility in the abstract. Witnesses spoke while translucent bonds stretched toward them from the jury box. When testimony aligned with truth as understood, the structure held. When it didn't, cracks spread unmistakably. Justice became faster and more brutal. There was no room for plausible deniability when trust failed visibly. Personal relationships suffered more quietly. People became hyper-aware of every promise, every implication. Casual reassurance grew dangerous. "I'll call you" carried weight. "Everything's fine" could shatter something if it wasn't true enough. Silence became safer than speech in many homes, not from distance, but from fear of breaking what was still holding. Children adapted first. They watched trust form and fracture like weather. They learned quickly that honesty wasn't about avoiding punishment, it was about structural integrity. A broken trust meant something real had been damaged, something that would take time and effort to rebuild, if it could be rebuilt at all. Rebuilding, it turned out, was possible but difficult. When someone apologized sincerely, the air between them didn't snap back into place. It softened first. The edges of the break grew translucent, then hazy, then slowly began to knit together thread by thread. Trust, once broken, never returned exactly as it had been. The repaired places were visible, faint seams where the world remembered what had happened. Some people refused to risk it. They withdrew, living carefully isolated lives where no trust could form, deeply enough to break. Around them, the air stayed clear and empty, safe, cold. Others did the opposite, forming bonds recklessly, breaking and repairing them over and over, accepting the scars as proof of living. The most devastating breaks happened in places people had taken for granted. A doctor delivering a rushed diagnosis watched the trust between her and a patient crack. Not because she was wrong, but because she hadn't listened. A lifelong friendship fractured beyond repair over a single moment of indifference. Not cruelty, not hatred, just not caring enough when it mattered. That was when humanity learned the hardest truth. Trust didn't break because of lies alone. It broke because of neglect, because of the moment you chose not to protect something fragile simply because it was familiar. Years passed and the world grew quieter, slower, more deliberate. People learned to feel the tension in the air before it cracked. They learned to stop mid-sentence when stress lines appeared. To ask, "Did I misunderstand you?" Before damage became permanent, trust was no longer an abstract virtue. It was architecture. And once you could see how easily it fractured, you stopped treating it as infinite. You handled it the way you handle glass that can still keep you warm if you don't drop it. Carefully, consciously, and with the full understanding that once it breaks, the shape of what you shared will never be exactly the same again.